Picture this. It is the dead of winter. December 1287. The forests of southern Poland are buried under a thick, suffocating silence. The kind of quiet that only comes when every living creature has gone to ground. The trees are skeletal. The ground is iron hard. The rivers are half frozen, their edges clawed with jagged black ice. The sky is the color of ash, pressing down on the land like a lid on a coffin. And then you hear it. Not a sound exactly. More of a feeling first. A low, rhythmic trembling in the earth beneath your feet. You're standing in a village, a small collection of timber houses and smoky hearths on the edge of the Vistula plain. And at first, you think it's thunder. But the sky is clear. No storm. And the rumbling doesn't stop. It grows. It deepens. It becomes something ancient and enormous. It's something your bones recognize before your mind does. Horses. Thousands of them. You run to the door, and what you see makes your blood turn to ice water. On every road, every frozen field, every forest track leading into your world. Riders. Mongol riders, wrapped in fur-lined lamellar armor, their ponies steaming in the cold, their banners, black, red, the horsetail standards of the Golden Horde, snapping in the wind. There are so many of them that the column stretches beyond the horizon. You cannot see where it ends. You cannot imagine where it ends, because it doesn't, not in any direction that matters. This is what the people of Poland faced in the winter of 1287. And here is what makes this story extraordinary. They didn't run. They didn't beg. They didn't surrender. They built a trap. What follows is one of the least told stories in all of medieval military history. A story of patience, deception, brutal cunning, and one of the most audacious ambushes ever executed against what was arguably the most fearsome military machine the world had ever seen. And it didn't just save Poland. It helped decide the fate of medieval Europe. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever heard of the Third Mongol invasion of Poland? Probably not. And that is exactly the problem with how we teach history. We remember the disasters. We forget the victories that quietly saved civilizations. We remember 1241, when the Mongols crushed the Polish knights at Legnica and left a pile of severed ears 9 feet high. But we never talk about 1288, when Poland turned the tables and made the Mongols bleed. So here's what I want you to do right now. Pause for 1 second. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching this from? Your city, your country. It doesn't matter. Because the story we're about to tell together is one that belongs to every person who has ever faced something that seemed impossible and found a way to survive anyway. And if you're new here and you want more stories like this, battles where history hung by a thread and someone pulled it back from the edge, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you are going to want to stay for this. Now, let's go back to the beginning. You need to understand something before we go any further. This is not just a story about one battle in one winter in one corner of medieval Europe. This is a story about whether European civilization would survive at all. Think about what the Mongols had already done by 1287. In less than 60 years, the Mongol Empire had grown from a single tribe on the Central Asian steppe into the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. Larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. Larger than anything that came before or after, until the British Empire centuries later. And they had built it, not through diplomacy, not through trade, not through slow cultural absorption. They had built it through absolute, systematic, industrial-scale destruction. China, dismantled. Persia, dismantled. The Abbasid Caliphate, the center of Islamic civilization, the most sophisticated culture on the planet. Baghdad sacked in 1258. The caliph rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The contents of its libraries thrown into the Tigris River, which ran black with ink for days. Russia, subjugated. Hungary, devastated. And Poland had already been hit once, in 1241, in a campaign so brutal that entire provinces were depopulated, cities reduced to ash, and the church bells of Kraków were silenced for a generation. When the Mongols moved, they didn't just conquer land. They erased civilizations. They broke the continuity of culture, of learning, of governance, of identity. They created voids so deep that some regions never fully recovered. The ruins of their passage could still be found centuries later. And in 1287, they were back. This time, the target wasn't just Poland. The Mongols under Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan, two powerful commanders of the Golden Horde, were coming with an army large enough to push all the way to the Atlantic if they chose. Now, Central Europe was politically fragmented, militarily exhausted, spiritually terrified. If Poland fell this time, truly fell, there was no second line of defense. Germany was divided. France was distracted. England was an island far away. The Pope could pray, but could not field an army. What happened in the forests and river valleys of southern Poland in the winter of 1287 and 1288 was not just a military engagement between two medieval armies. It was a hinge point, a moment where the trajectory of the entire continent bent, shifted, and moved in a different direction. Let that sink in. A handful of Polish commanders, operating in a fractured kingdom with limited resources, against the most battle-hardened military machine in the world. They chose not to meet the Mongols on the open field, where they would certainly die. See, they chose to make the land itself into a weapon. They chose patience over impulse, deception over honor, survival over glory. And it worked. To understand the trap, you need to understand how Poland got here. And to understand that, you need to go back to 1241, because that year left a wound in the Polish psyche so deep that it still shaped every decision their commanders made 46 years later. In February of 1241, a Mongol army under General Batu Khan and his brilliant strategist Subutai launched a coordinated invasion of Central Europe, unlike anything that had ever been seen before. This wasn't a raid. It was a surgical military campaign designed to neutralize every major European military force simultaneously, before they could coordinate a response. The Mongols split into multiple columns, attacking Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans at the same time, moving so fast that messengers couldn't outrun them, let alone armies. The Polish response was brave. It was courageous. It was disastrously, catastrophically inadequate. Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious, assembled what he believed was a formidable force. Polish knights, Teutonic knights, German miners from Silesia, Moravian auxiliaries, French Templars. Roughly 15,000 to 25,000 men. He marched out to meet the Mongols at the field of Legnica on April 9th, 1241, fully expecting a battle in the old European tradition. Two armies facing each other. Honor, formation, the clash of steel. The Mongols had no interest in that tradition. What happened at Legnica was not a battle. It was a lesson. The Mongols feigned a retreat, luring the Polish cavalry in pursuit, and then wheeled and encircled them. Mongol archers on their small, impossibly fast steppe ponies poured volley after volley into the Polish formations. The knights who hadn't already exhausted their horses, following the false retreat, found themselves surrounded, flanked, fragmented.
My lords,
Henry the Pious himself was killed. His head was mounted on a spear and paraded before the walls of Legnica. According to sources, The Mongols cut off the right ear of every enemy killed on the field and filled 9 large sacks before moving on. 9 sacks of ears. Think about that. Not trophies, not decoration, a logistical tally. The Mongols were so experienced, so methodical, so utterly without sentiment about killing that they had developed a standardized accounting system for the dead. And then they turned south and helped destroy the Hungarian army at Mohi 2 days later, killing perhaps 60,000 men. Poland was shattered. The country that existed before April 1241 was not the same country that slowly, painfully began to rebuild after the Mongols withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because they had accomplished their objectives and the great Khan Ogadai had died, requiring the armies to return to Karakorum for succession decisions. The Mongols left because they chose to, not because anyone stopped them. That knowledge, that particular flavor of humiliation, of knowing that the enemy departed not in defeat, but in indifference, that knowledge burrowed into the bones of every Polish commander who came after. For 4 decades, it shaped how they trained, how they built fortifications, how they thought about war. And here is where the political situation in 1287 becomes crucial to understanding what happened next, because Poland, in the late 13th century, was not a unified kingdom. It was a collection of fragmented duchies, ruled by competing Piast princes, who spent as much energy fighting each other as defending their borders. The country had been formally divided since 1138 under the Testament of Bolesław the Rymith, and what followed was nearly a century and a half of fragmentation, internal war, shifting alliances, and petty dynastic conflicts. Duke Leszek II of Kraków, known as Leszek the Black, controlled one of the most important and most exposed regions of this fractured landscape. Kraków was the symbolic heart of Poland, historically its most important city, the seat of the bishops, or the cultural center of the country. And it sat directly in the path of any army coming from the east, across the Carpathian passes, and through the Lublin uplands. Leszek was not a saint. He was a complicated, often ruthless political player who had survived in the brutal ecosystem of Piast dynastic politics through a combination of strategic marriages, tactical betrayals, and a pragmatic willingness to make temporary alliances with enemies when necessary, including, on occasion, the Mongols themselves. He had actually sought Mongol backing during his own dynastic struggles, which made him acutely aware of exactly how they operated, how they thought, and, critically, what their weaknesses were, because even the Mongols had weaknesses. And by 1287, after 40 years of careful, painful observation, the Poles were ready to exploit them. So let's be completely clear about what the Mongols were in 1287, because if we sanitize them, if we make them smaller than they were, then the achievement of stopping them becomes meaningless. The Golden Horde that launched the Third Mongol invasion of Poland was commanded by 2 men, Talabuga Khan, the nominal supreme commander and grandson of Batu Khan, and Nogai Khan, the real military genius of the operation, a commander of exceptional skill and ruthlessness who controlled the western steppe and had been running punishing raids across Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Byzantine Empire for years. These 2 men were not always aligned in their ambitions. There was tension between them, as there always was among Mongol commanders. But militarily, their army was a precision instrument of destruction. The Mongol military system of the late 13th century was still among the most sophisticated on the planet. Let's break down exactly what made it so terrifying, because this is not just background. This is the thing the Poles had to solve. First, mobility. The Mongol army traveled with multiple horses per rider. The estimates range from 3 to 5, sometimes more. This meant that a Mongol force could cover distances that completely broke European assumptions about how armies moved. They could advance 60, 70, even 100 miles in a single day by rotating horses, eating dried meat from saddlebags, sleeping in the saddle. While a European army's logistics train, the wagons, the supply carts, the fodder, the camp followers, ground their movement to 15 or 20 miles a day. The Mongols moved like weather. Fast, unpredictable, already upon you before your scouts could return. Second, archery. The composite recurve bow was the technological heart of Mongol warfare. Made from layered bone, wood, and sinew, these weapons were shorter than a longbow, but dramatically more powerful for their size, ideal for use from horseback. A Mongol archer could fire 10 to 12 aimed arrows per minute. They could hit a target at 200 meters. They could do this at full gallop, firing forward, sideways, or in the famous Parthian shot, over their shoulder while retreating. And the standard tactic wasn't to charge, it was to circle, to orbit the enemy formation just beyond the effective range of whatever weapons the enemy carried, pouring arrow after arrow into them, for hours if necessary, until the formation collapsed from exhaustion and casualties. Then the heavy cavalry would charge. Think of it like this. The Mongol army was both a sniper and a hammer. They could kill you from a distance before you could reach them. And if you broke and ran, the hammer fell. Third, intelligence and logistics. The Mongol military command had one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the medieval world. Before any major invasion, they sent agents ahead, sometimes years ahead, disguised as merchants, monks, or refugees. These agents mapped roads, river crossings, castle positions, grain stores, and local political loyalties. The Mongols knew more about Poland's geography and political divisions before they invaded than most Polish dukes knew about each other's territories. And their supply system, for a nomadic army, was surprisingly organized. They traveled with herds of cattle and understood seasonal grazing patterns and could sustain themselves in the field far longer than European armies that depended on static supply lines. Fourth, psychological warfare. This was perhaps the most devastatingly effective weapon in the Mongol arsenal, the reputation alone. Before the army arrived, stories traveled ahead of it. Stories of cities burned to foundations, of entire populations massacred, of defenders flayed alive, of skulls stacked in pyramids outside conquered walls. These stories were not always exaggerated. They were frequently accurate, and the Mongols cultivated them deliberately because terror served the same military function as an arrow or a spear. It paralyzed decision-making. It caused defenders to flee before the army arrived, leaving walls unmanned. It broke coalitions before they could form. And in 1287, it was working again. As the Mongol columns crossed the Carpathian passes in December of that year and fanned out across southern Poland, towns emptied. Refugees streamed west and north. The roads were choked with people carrying whatever they could. Bundles of clothing, livestock, infants. The Mongols burned what was left behind. Sandomierz was sacked. Smaller settlements across the Lublin and Sandomierz regions were put to the torch. The smoke of burning villages could be seen from Kraków itself. The army that came was estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 warriors, depending on the source. Medieval chronicles notoriously inflated enemy numbers, and we should apply appropriate skepticism. But even at the conservative end, this was a force that overwhelmed anything Poland could field in open combat, and the Mongols knew it. They had beaten Poland before. They expected to beat it again. This confidence, this bone-deep, experience-backed, historically verified confidence, was about to become their most dangerous vulnerability. Here is what happened in Poland between 1241 and 1287 that the history books almost never tell you. They learned. Not in the abstract way that implies mere intellectual understanding. They learned the way that wounded, humiliated, desperate people learn, through necessity, through failure, through the grinding work of rebuilding something on top of the ruins of what was destroyed. And what they rebuilt was different from what came before. Smarter, more adaptive, more honest about its own limitations. The first lesson was the hardest. You cannot beat the Mongols in the open field. Not with European cavalry tactics, not with feudal levies, not with knights, however brave and however well-armored. The Mongol system was designed to destroy exactly that kind of fighting. The combination of mobility, archery, and feigned retreat had proven fatal to European heavy cavalry at Legnica, at Mohi, and at every other engagement. The Mongols had, in a very real sense, already solved European military doctrine. They had a counter to everything the Europeans brought to the field. So the Polish commanders, and this was not a single genius's insight, but a collective, decades-long process of institutional learning, concluded that you couldn't fight the Mongols. You had to make them fight on your terms, or better yet, make them fight terrain. After 1241, there was a dramatic acceleration in castle construction across Poland. Historians call it the castle building program, though that sanitized phrase doesn't quite capture the desperate urgency behind it. Bolesław the Chaste, who had been duke during the 1241 invasion and had survived by fleeing to Hungary, returned and immediately began ordering stone fortifications built on every commanding hilltop, every critical river crossing, every defensible ridge along the likely invasion routes. These weren't the grand romantic castles of the Western imagination, tall towers, gleaming walls, decorative battlements. These were functional, brutal, practical strongpoints, built from local limestone, designed not to look impressive but to be impregnable to an army without proper siege equipment. And crucially, the Mongols had almost no effective siege capability against properly constructed stone fortifications. This was the weakness. This was the crack in the armor of the unstoppable war machine. The Mongols were masters of mobility. They were masters of the open field. But a well-stocked stone castle on a hilltop required time, engineering expertise, and heavy equipment to reduce. And the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, operating at the far western extreme of its logistical reach, typically had none of those things. They had been known to capture wooden fortifications and earthworks by simply lighting them on fire. Stone walls were a different problem entirely. They couldn't be burned. They couldn't be quickly knocked down with the equipment a fast-moving Mongol column typically carried. And a siege meant time. Time during which foraging parties got ambushed, horses were depleted, food ran short, and the Polish forces massing outside the siege perimeter could begin to operate. So the castle-building program was not just construction. It was strategic doctrine. It was a decision about how Poland would fight the next war. But there was a second, more subtle development happening simultaneously, and it was born not from policy, but from necessity. In the decades between 1241 and 1287, Polish commanders, many of them minor nobles, and local military leaders, who didn't appear in grand chronicles, but who kept the borderlands alive, developed what we might call deep familiarity with the terrain they were defending. They knew every river, every forest, every bog. They knew which roads turned to impassable mud in wet weather. They knew which valleys channeled advancing columns into killing grounds. They knew where a Mongol force on the march would be forced by the terrain to compress, to slow, to become predictable. They built this knowledge the same way a hunter learns a forest, by walking it, sleeping in it, bleeding in it, decade after decade, until the land itself became an extension of their military thinking. And there was one more element: the scouts. By the 1280s, the Polish border lords maintained a sophisticated early warning network of riders and observers along the eastern and southeastern approaches. These weren't formal military units. They were local men, some of them hardly more than farmers, who knew the Mongol patterns, who could read the signs of a large force crossing the steppe, who could ride fast and get word back to the castles in time for the populations to evacuate and the garrisons to prepare. Leszek the Black was not a great general in the mythological sense. He was not a warrior of dazzling individual heroism, but he understood the system his predecessors had built. And when the scouts came riding in December 1287, when the word arrived that the Mongols were crossing the Carpathians in force, he did not panic. He did not run. He did something the Mongols had almost never encountered before. He waited, and he planned. There is a moment in every conflict, often invisible to the participants at the time, when the psychological balance shifts. When the side that seemed weaker stops defining itself by its weakness and begins defining itself by its knowledge. When fear transforms into something colder, harder, or more useful, calculation. For Leszek and his commanders, that moment came from an unexpected direction, not from a military victory or a divine sign or an inspirational speech before assembled troops. It came from a piece of intelligence that revealed, with devastating clarity, exactly what the Mongols thought of Poland and of their own chances of success. The Mongols came in 1287, not just to raid, as they had done in intervening years in smaller operations. They came with the explicit intention of reducing Kraków, the symbolic heart of Polish resistance, and demonstrating once and for all that there was no fortress, no plan, no strategy that could stop the Golden Horde from doing whatever it wished in this part of Europe. They came, in other words, with arrogance. The arrogance of a force that had beaten this enemy before and fully expected to beat it again. They had heard about the new stone castles, and according to chronicles from the period, notably accounts preserved in Polish ecclesiastical records and the later work of Jan Długosz, Poland's great 15th century historian who drew on earlier sources, the Mongol commanders dismissed them. They had reduced fortifications before in China, in Persia, in Russia. They had engineers. They had experience. They would deal with these Polish stones the way they had dealt with everything else. This dismissiveness, this failure to adapt their assessment to a genuinely changed situation, is what the Polish commanders recognized as their opening. There is also a personal dimension to this moment that deserves acknowledgement. So because history is never just about institutions and systems, it is always, at its heart, about people making decisions under pressure. And Leszek the Black in the winter of 1287 was a man carrying enormous psychological weight. He had political enemies within Poland itself, other Piast princes who disputed his control of Kraków, who had allied against him within living memory, who might not come to his aid when the Mongols arrived, and who might, in the worst case, see a weakened Leszek as an opportunity rather than a threat. He was defending not just a city, but his own political survival. The same Mongol invasion that threatened to destroy Poland also, paradoxically, or threatened to destroy him specifically, because a successful defense that required him to share credit, or that left his forces depleted, would leave him vulnerable to domestic enemies. And yet he made the call. He sent riders to the castellans of the surrounding fortresses, Sandomierz, Łęczyca, the hilltop castles of the Kraków region. The message was not a request, it was a command. Hold your walls. Do not come out to fight. Draw the Mongols in. Exhaust them. Bleed them slowly. And when I tell you the moment has come, strike. The trap was set. Let's get into the mechanics of what happened, because this is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, where it stops being about courage and becomes about architecture. Not the architecture of buildings, but the architecture of a military plan. And like all great plans, it was elegant precisely because it was simple. The fundamental insight was this: the Mongol army's greatest strength, its mobility, its ability to strike fast and withdraw before a response could be organized, became a liability in an environment where there was nowhere to productively advance to, where every step forward cost something and yielded nothing. Picture the geography of southern Poland in the late 13th century. The Mongols entering from the southeast would be moving through a landscape that funneled them naturally toward Kraków, through the Lublin uplands, across the upper Vistula, into the valleys and ridges of the Kraków-Częstochowa Jura. This is not flat steppe. This is complicated terrain. Forests of beech and pine on limestone ridges, narrow river valleys that forced columns to compress, boggy lowlands along the watercourses that turned horses' legs to cement if you pushed them too hard in winter. And on every commanding position along this route, a castle. The Polish strategic plan was what a modern military analyst would call a defense in depth combined with an attritional strategy. The idea was not to stop the Mongol advance at a single defensive line, which was impossible, but to slow it, fragment it, and exhaust it through a series of layered obstacles, each of which required the Mongols to expend time, energy, and manpower to address. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to drain a bathtub through a screen. You can pour all the water you want through it, but every cup of water costs you something. It takes longer, it loses energy, and eventually you're left with much less pressure than you started with. So the castles were the screen. Each fortification that the Mongols encountered presented them with a choice: bypass it and leave a hostile, garrisoned position at your back, threatening your supply lines and your retreat route. Or invest it, meaning commit forces to besieging it, which means days or weeks of delay, while the rest of your army sits in the field, foraging for food in a winter landscape that had been deliberately stripped of supplies in advance. The Poles had, in the weeks before the invasion arrived, implemented what we would now call a scorched-earth denial operation in the expected invasion corridor. Grain stores were moved into the castles or destroyed. Livestock was driven north and west. Civilians evacuated. The Mongols found a landscape that looked inhabited, but had been systematically emptied of everything that a large army needs to sustain itself. This was not random. This was deliberate. And it required discipline. The discipline to burn your own fields, slaughter your own animals, abandon your own homes, because the long-term survival of the community depended on denying the invaders the resources to stay. Now, here is where Leszek's tactical thinking becomes particularly sophisticated. He knew the Mongols would come to Kraków. The city was both the strategic prize and the psychological target. Capturing or sacking Kraków would be a signal to all of Poland and to all of Europe that the Horde was still supreme. Leszek knew this and used it. He used Kraków itself as bait. The population of Kraków had been evacuated to the defensive strong points outside the city, particularly to the fortified castle of Wawel, which sits on a limestone outcrop above the Vistula and was essentially impregnable to the equipment a Mongol raiding column would carry. The city itself, or at least those parts of it that could not be defended, was effectively offered up. If the Mongols wanted to sack the lower city, they could have it. What they couldn't have was the castle and its garrison. While the Mongols committed to the siege of Wawel and other fortified positions, while they camped in the January cold, running short of fodder for their horses, their foraging parties finding nothing but empty barns and burned haystacks, their light cavalry probing for weaknesses and finding stone, the Polish military force was assembling outside the Mongol operational radius. This was the critical element. While the Mongols were fixed, while their attention was locked on the stone walls that refused to fall, while their horses grew thin and their men grew cold and frustrated. A Polish relief force under commanders including Leszek himself, and, according to some sources, forces from neighboring duchies that had been persuaded, finally, to cooperate, was moving through the forests and secondary tracks that the Mongol scouts had either not covered or had underestimated. The terrain was everything. The deep winter forests of the Polish Jura and the valleys of the Kraków-Wieluń uplands provided cover for movement that would have been impossible on the open steppe. Men and horses could move under the forest canopy and be invisible from any distance. The Mongol cavalry, so terrifyingly effective in open country, was awkward in dense woodland. Their bows required space to use effectively. Their famous flanking maneuvers needed room to develop. In a forest ambush, at close range, the equation changed dramatically. And that is exactly where Leszek intended to fight. The Mongols were confident. You have to understand that above all else. They had done this before. They knew what resistance looked like, and they knew how it ended. Their pattern recognition, refined across decades and continents of conquest, told them that they were watching the same movie they had always watched. The Poles were hiding behind walls. They were burning their supplies. They were retreating before the horde. All familiar behavior. All the behavior of a defeated people performing the ritual of a defeat they had already psychologically accepted. What the Mongol commanders could not process, because they had no frame of reference for it, was that the behavior they were reading as defeat was actually the first act of a plan. There is a concept in military thinking sometimes called making the enemy fight the battle you want to fight, instead of the battle they want to fight. It is easy to describe and extraordinarily difficult to execute because it requires that you be willing to absorb cost and pain in the short term in order to set up a decisive advantage in the long term. It requires discipline and patience that runs directly against the most powerful human instinct in combat, the instinct to react, to strike back, or to defend your people and your ground right now. Leszek's commanders had that discipline, and the Mongol commanders, in their confidence, did not see it being applied. As the days of the siege stretched into weeks and January 1288 became February, several things were happening simultaneously inside the Mongol operational picture that were invisible to the commanders, but devastating in their cumulative effect. The horses were suffering. The steppe ponies, that formed the backbone of Mongol military power, were powerful and hardy, but they were accustomed to grazing on the open steppe, where sparse winter grasses could still be found under shallow snow. The forested hills of southern Poland in deep winter offered almost nothing. The scorched earth preparation meant the Mongols had to carry every kilogram of feed they had brought with them, or watch their horses weaken. A cavalry army without fit horses is not a cavalry army. It's a foot army with expensive, dying baggage. The men were cold. The Golden Horde troops were themselves tough beyond modern comprehension, accustomed to campaigning in brutal conditions. But accustomed to is not the same as immune to. Deep winter in southern Poland, especially in the river valleys below the limestone ridges, where cold air pooled and fog gathered, was a particular kind of miserable that even experienced steppe warriors found grinding. Frostbite among the foraging parties. Illness spreading through the camps. The small, dispiriting degradation of cold that never quite breaks, but never quite lets up. The supply lines were stretched and increasingly insecure. The Mongol columns had moved fast through the Carpathian passes, confident in their ability to sustain themselves from the land. They found a landscape that had been stripped. Sending supply parties back toward the passes meant sending them through territory where Polish local forces, the retinues of the Castellans, the armed retainers of local nobles, and increasingly the organized units of Leszek's gathering relief army, could and did ambush them. Not in pitched battles, not in heroic charges, but in the sudden, brutal forest ambushes that left a supply convoy dead in a narrow track and vanished back into the trees before any organized response was possible. The Mongols were not being defeated, not yet, but they were being ground down, slowly, quietly, with the patient precision of a people who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to do this. And then the trap closed. Think about that moment. Not the dramatic Hollywood version with one big climactic battle. The real trap was subtler than that, and more devastating. Because the most effective trap isn't the one that kills the enemy in a single blow. It's the one that leaves the enemy confused about exactly when and how they lost. It came from multiple directions. The exact details of the engagement or engagements in early 1288 are imperfectly preserved. Medieval Polish chronicles are inconsistent in their details, and the Mongol sources for this period are sparse on campaigns that ended in withdrawal rather than victory. But the broad outline is clear from multiple sources, including the Chronicle of Mieczysław, fragmentary records from the Kraków Cathedral chapter, and the later synthesis of Jan Długosz. The Polish relief force, assembled in the forests north and west of Kraków, struck not at the main body of the Mongol army, but at its vulnerabilities. Supply lines, foraging parties, the detachments that had spread out across the landscape in search of food and plunder. These were not small operations. They were coordinated. Multiple forces moving on multiple tracks simultaneously, designed to create maximum disruption across the widest possible front, to prevent the Mongols from consolidating and responding effectively. The Mongol commander's first instinct was the right one. Concentrate, pull in the foraging parties, form a defensive perimeter around the main camp, get the horses rested and ready for a decisive engagement or a controlled withdrawal. But that instinct was a response to the visible threat, and the visible threat was not the main event. Leszek's cavalry, the core of the Polish relief force, the mounted knights and retainers who formed the professional military spine of his army, had not yet committed. They were waiting for the Mongols to concentrate, waiting for the Mongol commanders to make the decision to withdraw, because a withdrawing army, particularly one moving through difficult forest terrain, is at its most vulnerable in the moments of transition, when the defensive perimeter dissolves and the column forms for movement. And here is the critical detail that made the ambush work: the Mongol withdrawal route. To exit southern Poland with a significant army, the Mongols had to pass back through the river valleys and through the forested corridors that led to the Carpathian passes. There was no other viable route for an army of their size in winter. The rivers were partially frozen, but not reliably enough to cross at every point. The lowlands were boggy under their snow cover. The high ground was forested and broken. The exit routes were, by geography, choke points, and choke points are where ambushes live. The Polish forces had prepared positions in the forest along the expected withdrawal corridor. Not elaborate fortifications. There wasn't time for that, and they weren't necessary. Deep woodland in winter provides natural concealment. Men on foot in white-gray winter clothing, standing motionless among snow-covered trees, are invisible until they move. The riders waiting in the secondary forest, tracks behind the tree line, were equally invisible. And the geometry of the terrain, a narrow valley, a frozen watercourse forcing the column to compress, or trees pressing in from both sides, that geometry did the work that walls and ditches would have done in a different kind of battle. When the blow landed, it landed hard and fast, short, violent, total. The Mongol column, already compressed by the terrain, suddenly found itself in contact on both flanks simultaneously. Arrows from the tree line. Not the disciplined volley fire of a large archery unit, but close-range targeted shots at individual riders and horses. Horses screaming and going down in the confined space, blocking movement, creating chaos in the column. Then the cavalry from the flanks and rear. Polish knights hitting the already disrupted column from multiple directions, driving into the gaps created by the initial archery strike, cutting the column into sections before it could reform. The Mongols were not destroyed, but let's be historically precise about this. The Golden Horde armies of this period were not the kind of force that could be annihilated by a smaller Polish force in a single engagement. What happened instead was a series of sharp, brutal encounters that extracted a price, imposed disorder, and, crucially, destroyed the psychological certainty that had brought the Mongols into Poland in the first place. The army of Talabuga and Nogai retreated. Not en route. The Mongols were too disciplined for that. But they retreated. They withdrew across the Carpathians. They left behind dead, and horses, and the shards of their confidence that this particular operation was ever going to deliver the decisive result they had planned for. The siege of Kraków failed. Wawel Castle held. The stone walls that the Mongol commanders had dismissed held. The Polish forces that the Mongol commanders had expected to collapse under pressure didn't collapse. And the land itself, stripped, forested, frozen, intimate in its terrain to those who defended it, and alien to those who invaded it. That land ate at the Mongol army until there was nothing left to do but go home. They went home. Let that land in your chest for a moment. The Golden Horde. The force that had crushed China, Persia, Russia, Hungary. The force that had killed Henry the Pious and stacked ears in 9 sacks at Legnica. That force came to southern Poland in the winter of 1287, fully intending to demonstrate once and for all that no stone wall and no forest strategy could stop them. And it went home. Not because it ran out of men. Not because a miraculous relief army appeared from outside Europe. Not because God intervened, though the Polish chroniclers were not shy about suggesting he did. But because a group of commanders who had studied their enemy for 40 years, who had built a system designed for this exact situation, who had the discipline to absorb pain and hold to the plan. Those commanders had finally, quietly, made the most powerful military force in the world pay too high a price for too little result. That is the trap, not a dramatic snapping shut mechanism with a visible moment of revelation. A slow, grinding geometry of cost calculation that the Mongols did not recognize as a defeat until they were already retreating from one. The Mongols never successfully invaded Poland again. Read that sentence again. After 1288, after the failure of the Third, and what proved to be the last major Mongol invasion of Polish territory, for the Golden Horde turned its military attention elsewhere. It returned to Hungary on further raids in subsequent years. It continued to dominate the Russian principalities and the steppe. But Poland, fractured, poor, politically divided Poland was left alone. The calculation had changed. The cost-benefit analysis of attacking Poland had shifted in a direction that made other targets more attractive. This was not because Poland had become militarily dominant. It hadn't. The Golden Horde was still enormously powerful and would remain so for decades. It was because Poland had successfully imposed an unfavorable exchange ratio, had made the act of invading Poland sufficiently costly and uncertain in outcome that the Mongol commanders looked at the map and found better options elsewhere. Think about what that means in historical terms. In the first decades of the 14th century, Poland began the long process of reunification under Władysław the Short and then Casimir the Great. It was Casimir who would be called the Great, precisely because he built on the breathing room purchased by the men who stopped the Mongols, built institutions, built law codes, built an economy, built the infrastructure of a genuine centralized state. He famously found Poland made of wood and left it made of stone, a phrase that is partly metaphor and partly literally true, referring to the continuation and expansion of exactly the castle-building program that had proven so decisive in 1288. Without the survival of Kraków, without the preservation of the cultural and institutional continuity that Wawel Castle represented, nor without the 40 years of painful, unglamorous preparation that made the defense of 1287 to 1288 possible. Without the commanders who had the discipline and the strategic patience to make the land into a weapon. Without all of that, there is no Casimir the Great. There is no reunified Poland. There is no Polish state that survives into the 14th century as a meaningful entity. And without that, there is a very different map of Central Europe in the late medieval period. A map without a Polish buffer state between the Horde and the fragmented German principalities. A map where the Mongol pressure continues westward, where the political geography of the continent develops along different lines, or where the specific combination of challenges and pressures that shaped the Renaissance and the eventual emergence of modern Europe looks fundamentally different. We cannot trace the full butterfly effect of these events. History doesn't work with that kind of precision. But we can say with confidence that the survival of the Polish state in the late 13th century mattered, that it created conditions that would not otherwise have existed, that the men who built those castles, who organized those ambushes, who had the patience to let the Mongols advance deep enough to get caught, those men changed the direction of history more profoundly than they knew. And almost none of them are remembered. There is a profound injustice in that, and also something deeply human about it. The history we celebrate tends to be the history of spectacle, the great charges, the climactic battles, the singular heroic moments that make good paintings and dramatic narratives. We remember Legnica, where thousands died gloriously and futilely. We struggle to remember 1288, where nobody died in a sufficiently dramatic way, where the victory was too distributed, too quiet, too methodical to produce an obvious hero. But think about what we lose when we only remember spectacle. We lose the lesson. We lose the understanding that the most important battles in history are often the ones that don't look like battles at all. That the most powerful military strategy is sometimes patience. That the most valuable thing a defender can build is not a sword, but a system of fortifications, intelligence, terrain knowledge, deep political discipline, and strategic restraint that turns an attacker's greatest strengths into liabilities. We lose the understanding that the underdogs of history who survived weren't always the ones with the most inspiring battle cries. Sometimes, they were the ones with the most carefully marked maps. There is also something important to notice about the Mongol side of this story. The failure of 1287 to 1288 contributed to a broader set of pressures that would, within a few decades, begin to fracture the Golden Horde itself. The internal tensions between Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan that had existed before the invasion of Poland worsened afterward. And within a few years, those tensions collapsed into open civil war. Nogai Khan was killed in 1299 in a conflict with Talabuga's successor, Toktu. The Horde began the long, yet slow process of internal disintegration that would eventually, by the 15th century, reduce it from a terrifying continental power to a collection of smaller khanates. Poland was not the only cause of that decline, obviously. Empires fall for many reasons, and the Golden Horde had internal structural pressures that had nothing to do with southern Poland in winter. But the failure to decisively reduce Poland removed a potential source of enormous wealth and momentum that might have prolonged the Horde's coherence. History never tells us what would have happened if the Mongols had succeeded in 1288. But it gives us strong reason to believe that the success they didn't achieve would have made them harder to resist, longer, the defeat mattered, even a defeat that didn't look like one. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. Leszek the Black is not a great hero of the popular imagination. He is not the kind of figure who inspires epic poems or cinematic reenactments. He was, by most accounts, a difficult man, politically complicated, not especially beloved by his own people even in his lifetime. He died in 1288, possibly the same year as the campaign we've been discussing, possibly shortly after. And his death plunged Kraków into yet another round of pious, dynastic politics. He did not live to see the fruits of what he and his commanders had accomplished. And yet, the system he operated within, the 40 years of preparation that preceded the crisis, the commanders who built the castles and developed the intelligence networks and trained the soldiers for forest warfare and organized the scorched-earth preparations, the ordinary people who burned their own grain stores and drove their livestock into the forests and evacuated to the strong points on the hills, trusting that the discomfort was worth the survival. All of those people, most of them nameless in the chronicles, made the trap possible. What they teach us, these nameless people, is something that runs counter to most of what popular history wants us to believe. They teach us that civilization is rarely saved by a single act of genius or a single moment of heroic will. It is saved again and again by the accumulation of small decisions, by the castle built 10 years before it was needed, by the scout who learned to read Mongol trail signs and pass that knowledge to his son, by the noble who burned his own estates rather than leave them for the enemy, by the commander who resisted the entirely understandable human impulse to march out and fight and die gloriously, and chose instead the harder, quieter path of strategic patience. We live in a world that celebrates decisive action, that prizes the visible, the dramatic, the immediate. We tell stories of charges and counterattacks, of moments where individual will bend the course of events. Those stories are real, and they matter. But so does this story. So does the story of a people who looked at an enemy that had beaten them before, that was larger and faster and richer in military experience, and who said, "We will not fight the battle you want to fight. We will make a different battle. We will use the land and the cold and the forests and your own confidence against you. We will be patient when every instinct screams at us to act. We will absorb pain now so that our children can live later." That kind of intelligence, the intelligence of strategic patience, of system building, of making your environment into your greatest weapon, is not celebrated enough. It doesn't fit on a coat of arms. It doesn't make a triumphant painting. But it is, very often, the thing that actually determines whether civilizations survive. Think about that the next time someone tells you that the only meaningful response to power is more power. Think about the Polish commanders in the winter forests of 1288, watching the Mongol columns retreat through the snow, and understanding, quietly, without fanfare, without anyone to witness the moment, that they had won. Not with a charge, not with a single decisive blow, but with 40 years of work that turned the most powerful army in the world into a force that was simply no longer capable of getting what it came for. That's the real lesson of the 1288 trap. Not that patience is passive, not that defense is weakness, but that the deepest form of strategic intelligence is the ability to choose the terrain of your conflict, to make the enemy fight the battle that serves you, not the battle that serves them. And sometimes, history turns on exactly that choice. I want to hear from you. What part of this story hit you hardest? Was it the 40 years of preparation, the scorched earth discipline, the realization that a victory this important could be so completely erased from popular memory? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, And the discussions that come out of these videos are, honestly, some of the best history conversations happening anywhere on the internet. And if you made it all the way here, if you sat with this story for an hour and let yourself feel the weight of what those commanders accomplished, then you already know that this channel is for you. Hit subscribe, because the history we talk about here isn't the history of the comfortable and the celebrated. It's the history of the people who found a way when there shouldn't have been one. The next time someone tells you a story is already decided. Remember the Poles in the winter of 1287. Remember that the trap was already built before the enemy arrived. History doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to those who understand the ground they're fighting on.